I think it's time to look again at each class and see the most used roles in PvE group content like fractals, strikes, raids and dungeons, because in open world you can play anything you want. I will take each class and show you what are the main roles that can be covered so you can take an informed decision about how fast you can find a group or if you want to know what roles your class can cover. I will start in alphabetical order with Elementalist. Elementalist is a decent class nowadays with all main roles being covered. The only thing you'll struggle with is the low health and survivability. You can cover quickness DPS role with Catalyst and you need the minimum amount of boon investment for it. Alak heal and DPS with Tempest, which is better now as the Alak is pulsing each second compared to what we had before. I still think it needs at least 1 second base buff to account for some mechanics, but at least you'll not waste the overload if you are interrupted mid-cast. And the last role is DPS, which can be done with all 3 specs. I prefer to use the Catalyst DPS version as it is a minor change from the Quickness DPS Catalyst. Next is Engineer. Engineer is another class that can cover all roles but with better survivability than Elementalist and easier rotations. Quickness DPS can be covered by Scrapper. You can also be an off-heal with heal quickness scrappers, but you won't have much utility and I recommend to play heal quickness only if you need to be an off-heal. You can also cover Alacrity, both heal and DPS versions with Mechanist. The barrier generation and healing was a bit nerfed, but it's still the most requested class in group content as heal. The DPS version remained mostly unchanged, also it's one of the easier support specs to play as mech will take care of most of the stuff. You just need to make sure you are positioned correctly, don't stay too far away from the mech for too long and you'll be fine. And finally the DPS role can be covered by all 3 specs easily, with Holosmith being the most complicated but also the most rewarding. I also want to mention something very important here. At the moment, mech cannot be used underwater, so keep that in mind for the future if it's something that you're interested in. Moving on to Guardian. Guardian is another class that had a few changes over the last few months and it's still a main spec in group content. Guardian is best for covering the quickness roles. You can heal quickness Firebrand with lots of support wounds and easy to play, or play quickness DPS Firebrand. One thing to note here. Firebrand is mostly a Condi spec class. You can still play it as a power DPS, but you'll be at a disadvantage. You can also cover heal or DPS Alak with Willbender, but this is something rarely seen in pack groups. Both options are decent with minimum boon support on gear, but you need to constantly hit the boss to generate Alacrity. And finally the DPS is covered very good by all 3 specs, with Dragon Hunter being buffed quite a bit over the last balance patches. Mesmer is next, and this class is a bit different compared to what we had so far, as it can still cover all 3 roles, but only the DPS variants. You can cover quickness DPS with Chrono and be quite decent at it, it's just that it relies on clones to keep up quickness. Then you can elect DPS with Mirage and Chrono, but I would recommend Mirage as it's a very simple rotation and the DPS is very good. Also, the DPS role can be covered again with all 3 specs, but keep in mind that Necromancer is the most complex spec to play and Virtuoso the easiest to play, while Mirage being somewhere in the middle as it also relies on specific bosses to have higher DPS. Next we have Necromancer. Necro is still one of the most requested classes as heal Scourge for Bone Skinner. But Scourge is a very good spec as a full DPS role too. You can also cover quickness DPS as Harbinger, but it's a spec rarely seen as bone support. You'll see it a lot more as full DPS along with Reaper and Scourge. Also, if you need a sturdy light armor class, then this is the class for you, except Harbinger spec since that will remove your HP and not add the Shroud to protect it. Ranger is up next. This class had a major rework last year, with spirits being changed to provide alacrity. Since then the class covers Alac heal with Druid pretty well. You also have access to stability and block now. And the Alac DPS version with Untamed, which had the buff to Fervent Force, so it applies to Defiant foes too. This means you can count on the cooldown reduction to use the spirits, and have 100% alacrity uptime. DPS role is covered by Soul Beast most of the time, but Untamed can be pretty good. As for quickness, well, Ranger cannot cover any quickness role. Revenant is a very good class, which was also buffed quite a few times to different specs. Now it can cover all 3 main roles easily. You can play quickness, heal and DPS on Herald. I would not recommend to do that in Fractals, as depending on the instabilities you may need to do burst healing, and if you're affected by Agony that will be lowered by quite a lot. Then you'll need to stay more in center stance and you'll lose the quickness uptime. But if you go quickness DPS route, then you are all good with very decent numbers on DPS and lots of stability if needed with Dwarf stance. Next is Alacrity, which can be both heal or DPS with Renegade. The Alacrity duration was buffed recently and you need a minimum of 33% boon duration to keep up 100% Alacrity uptime. I recommend to get at least 50% just to be sure, but still this is awesome for the Alac DPS version. And the DPS role can be covered by all 3 specs, but it's better to do it as Vindicator since it was buffed and the DPS is decent. If the dodge mechanic annoys you, then use DPS Renegade. Also one bonus mention here, if you use the power version for Quickness Herald, then you can use the same equipment for the Alacrity Renegade, which will minimize the amount of gold investment required to cover all roles. Tiff is next, and I can say that it's still a very squishy option. You should have a high level Jade bot core installed to help you out a bit with the squishiness. As for roles options, you can do heal and DPS Alacrity with Spectre, and that is about it for support option. The healing version is barely seen in group content now, but it's still viable, and if you do not like the playstyle, you can move the gear to Mechanist or Druid, and do the same thing there. As for the Alike DPS version, it's still quite good with decent damage. For DPS roles you can go with all 3 specs again, as Thief is mostly a DPS oriented class. That die has very high DPS, but it can be a bit hard to master, and also has a low range. Daredevil is decent with both power and Condi options, and Spectre is also very good but only has a Condi version. Finally, we have Warrior, the class only focused on DPS that finally received the option to provide quickness support through banners last year. But you'll be able to do only quickness DPS support, and most recommended spec for that is Bladesworn. There used to be a heal version created by Muckluck, but that was quickly nerfed for some reason. The DPS role can be covered by all 3 specs, with Spellbreaker being the easiest to play and most seen nowadays in group content. Bladesworn received some ranged DPS, but the animations were changed and lost a bit of DPS, and Berserker is the lowest on the DPS scale, but still usable. And those were all the classes in the current meta, with all the roles, strengths and weaknesses covered as of March 2023. Let's see if or how much the meta will change during this year, and I hope this video helped you, and I will see you in game. If you want to see more content like this, please let me know in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed the video, please click the like and subscribe buttons.